When Yom Tov falls out on Friday, in order to be able to cook on that Friday for Shabbos, we need to make an Erev Tafshilin. Now, based on the simple halacha, you would be allowed to eat the Erev Tafshilin, which is made of a challah and a cooked food. You would be allowed to eat it as soon as you finish preparing on the Friday for Shabbos. You can now eat that Erev. However, the Ma'aril instituted, and what he did himself was as well, is to use the bread of the Erev for Lechem Mishnah, as part of Lechem Mishnah for Friday night, again Shabbos morning, and finally actually breaking it and eating it during the third meal of Shabbos for Shalosh Udas. The Maharshal brings the same thing that the Maharam did the same minhag. The Alter Rebbe brings this in Shulchan Aruch as well. He says that even though you're allowed to eat the Erev as soon as you finished preparing the food, nevertheless, mitzvah min hamuvchar is to actually use it for one of the Su'udas Shabbos for Lechem Mishnah, and then the Alter Rebbe brings this minhag that some have the custom to use it for all of the meals. For the first meal, the second meal, Lechem Mishnah, and then finally breaking it and eating it at the third meal. Now, the source for using the bread of the Erev for another mitzvah is actually in the Gemara that says that Rav Ami and Rav Asi would do this with the Erev Chatzeros. An Erev Chatzeros is when you have a few shared, when a few people are sharing one courtyard, for example, each one in their own house, in order to be able to carry into the shared place. So they need to make this Erev Chatzeros, again with food. In this case, technically, you actually need to keep it until Shabbos comes in. But the Maharil and the Marshal bring the same minhag here as well. Rav Ami and Rav Asi, it says by Erev Chatzeros they would keep it to use it on Shabbos. And the Maharil and Marshal both bring this minhag regarding Erev Chatzeros, as I said before, to actually use it for all three meals. Now, when it comes to the Alter Rebbe by Erev Chatzeros, the Alter Rebbe says to use it by the second meal, by the morning meal. He does not mention this idea of using it for the third meal as opposed to Erev Tavshilin, where the Alter Rebbe said to use it for the third meal as well. And we need to understand this distinction. Why would there be a difference that for Erev Tavshilin we should use it for all three meals as opposed to Erev Chatzeros? In order to understand this, the Rebbe says, we first need to explore, isn't it better actually to use the Erev Chatzeros in the morning meal rather than leaving it for Shalosh Udas? Reason being is because the first two meals of Shabbos there's an absolute obligation to have bread and to have Lechem Mishnah. In Shalosh Udas, not everyone agrees you need Lechem Mishnah. Not everyone even agrees you need bread. Some say you could have mezonos or even fruit. So seemingly it would be a bigger mitzvah to use the bread of the Erev during the meal of the morning of Shabbos rather than Shalosh Udas. In order to explain this, the Rebbe is first going to look at the general idea of the reasons for Erev Tavshilin. So we have a machloikus in the Gemara. The Rava says that it's in order you should make sure you have good food for Shabbos. Good food for Shabbos, good food for Yom Tov. What Rashi explains that means is that because you're going to make the Erev before Yom Tov, that's going to remind you that Shabbos is coming up. So you're not going to finish all the food on Yom Tov. You remember Shabbos is coming and you're going to set aside and prepare food for Shabbos as well. Rav Ashi says that the reason is we're actually concerned that you shouldn't be cooking on Yom Tov for the middle of the week. Shabbos wouldn't have been a problem by itself to cook for Shabbos. But we're concerned that you shouldn't be cooking for the middle of the week on Yom Tov, and therefore we make you make an Erev Tavshilin in order to allow you to cook for Shabbos. And this will remind people that if you can't even cook for Shabbos, how much more so you wouldn't be able to cook for the middle of the week. In other words, according to Rav, it's more about the concern for covered Shabbos, to make sure you have food for Shabbos. According to Rav Ashi, it's more about covered Yom Tov, that you don't end up desecrating Yom Tov and cooking on Yom Tov for the middle of the week. The practical difference in halacha, the Rosh actually says, is that if it's about remembering for the needs of Shabbos to make sure you have food for Shabbos, then you must make it on Erev Yom Tov. You must make it at the time when you're preparing the food for Yom Tov. Otherwise, it's not going to help you. Whereas if it's only as a sign and to remind people the seriousness of Yom Tov, that we don't cook on Yom Tov for the middle of the week, then technically it can be done much earlier. It doesn't have to be done on Erev Yom Tov. Now, the Alter Rebbe actually brings both reasons for the Erev Tavshilin. He also brings this practical difference of regarding when the Erev needs to be made. And the Alter Rebbe paskins that lechatchila in the first instance, of course, it's better to do it on Erev Yom Tov, but b'diavad, if you made it even in advance, then it would be fine. Now, the Rebbe says the difference between the two reasons for Erev Tavshilin, whether it is the Yom Tov was the focus or Shabbos was the focus, is not only about that, whether it's l'kavod Shabbos or l'kavod Yom Tov, but rather, if we say, according to Rav Ashi's opinion, that it's for the benefit of Yom Tov, that is that we don't end up cooking on Yom Tov for the middle of the week, then really the whole takana of Erev Tavshilin is really more about a negative. It's more about what you're not allowed to do and that we shouldn't come to any issur, to any prohibition. That is, because we don't want you to end up cooking on Yom Tov for the middle of the week, therefore we have a takana that you shouldn't cook even for Shabbos, unless you made an Erev. In other words, it's all more of a negative approach to what the Erev is trying to achieve to make sure you don't do an Isser. And that's what the Erev itself is all about. It's more about don't cook for Shabbos, unless you made the Erev. On the other hand, if we say that it's all a covered Shabbos, in other words, to make sure you have food for Shabbos, that's Rava's opinion, then the whole takana is all a positive. It's first of all, so that you have food for Shabbos, and also then the way we view the main point of the Erev is that it's about reminding you of the needs of Shabbos. In other words, the reason why we don't cook without the Erev is only sort of to strengthen this takana, to point out this idea that we're going to prepare for Shabbos properly. The Rebbe says, when we look in the Gemara, we find that there's two psukim that the Gemara also uses as some sort of support and basis for the idea of Erev Tavshilin. There's a pasuk, Zocher es Yom HaShabbos l'katchoy, which the Gemara explains as meaning, Zochereyu, make sure to remember Shabbos, from someone that's going to be trying to make you forget it. What does that mean? Rashi explains that when Yom Tov falls out on Erev Shabbos, it's very likely that Shabbos can be forgotten because of Yom Tov. You're having so many meals on Yom Tov, you might not leave any food over for Shabbos, according to the honor of Shabbos. And therefore the pasuk is reminding you, Zacher es Yom HaShabbos l'katchoy. You only need to remember something when there's a chance of forgetting. So the Erev Tavshilin is helping you remember Shabbos. Then there's another limud in the Gemara. The Gemara says regarding the mun, which is actually this week's parsha as well, on the pasuk, Eis asher toifu eifu, veis asher tavashlu bashelu. The Gemara says, this double expression, what you'll bake, what you'll cook. This teaches us that you're not allowed to cook on Yom Tov for Shabbos unless you had something cooked already before. That's the Erev Tavshilin. You're not allowed to bake unless you had something baked before. So the way that the Rebbe is explaining in the Sikha what's going on over here is that the first pasuk, the Zocher es Yom HaShabbos l'katchoy, that's really going to be more fitting with Rava's opinion, which in other words that it's all about a positive. The idea of Erev Tavshilin is to help you remember Shabbos, put away food for Shabbos. On the other hand, the pasuk Eis asher toifu about don't bake unless you have something baked is more of a negative. You're not allowed to bake unless you have the Erev, which is more of Ashi's opinion, which told us that we're concerned that you shouldn't be baking on Yom Tov for the middle of the week, etc. Says the Rebbe, according to Rava's opinion, that the Erev is all about this positive attitude, to make sure that the Erev is reminding you constantly about Shabbos. It makes sense to say now that there's a point of holding on to this Erev, not only while you're preparing the food, but even during Shabbos and even the whole Shabbos. In other words, even though you finished technically making the preparations, but since the Erev is all about reminding you about Shabbos, so it makes sense that this memory coming from the Erev should actually continue on Shabbos as well, especially a Shabbos where there's more of a chance that it can be forgotten. Then maybe there's even more of a reason to really have things to remind you about the special inyan of Shabbos. So in other words, according to Rava, the point of the Erev is the memory of Shabbos, so let's hold on to it as long as possible during Shabbos as well. Says that now we can understand a diuk in the Alter Rebbe, that what we discussed before, regarding the difference between Erev Tavshilin and Erev Chatzeros. Erev Tavshilin, the Alter Rebbe said, the minhag of keeping it all the way to the third meal, as opposed to Erev Chatzeros, where we said use it in the morning. That is, by Erev Tavshilin, since we have this opinion that the Erev Tavshilin is part of the Zocher es Yom HaShabbos to help you remember Shabbos, so that it makes sense to use it as much as possible on Shabbos and for all the needs of Shabbos, all the way to the last need, which is Shalosh Shudas. And that's why you should use it all the way till the third meal. Whereas Erev Chatzeros, which is totally not connected with this whole concept of Zocher es Yom HaShabbos, therefore so there's no point of keeping it to Shalosh Shudas, and therefore going back to what we said originally, if anything, it makes sense to use it. If we want to use it for a proper mitzvah, then use it rather in the morning rather than later. The Rebbe now turns to the Eirah and Avodas Hashem, and the difference between these two opinions, whether the Erev is l'kavod Shabbos or l'kavod Yom Tov. Generally, the difference between Shabbos and Yom Tov we know is, Chassidus explains that Shabbos is a day that's holy on its own. It represents a Kedusha that's removed from all negativity. Yom Tov, on the other hand, is the idea, it's a weekday. And now, Beis Din is going to establish this day as Yom Tov, based on Rosh Chodesh. We brought the Kedusha now into a regular mundane weekday. So now, says the Rebbe, the opinion that says that the focus of Erev Tavshilin was more about Yom Tov, in other words, it's the point of the gather of Erev Tavshilin, as we said, is more then going to be more about a negative. We're concerned you shouldn't cook, you shouldn't bake, and all of that. So then the whole idea is, if we're focusing on Yom Tov, that's really what Yom Tov is about. Yom Tov is about removing ourselves from the regular weekdays, and we're going to bring some Kedusha into it. On the other hand, the opinion that says it's all about Shabbos, the Erev, in other words, it says Shabbos is a day of Kedusha, then we're not speaking about negating anything. The whole idea of the gather of the Erev Tavshilin itself is more a positive, it's more of Kedusha, it's more about Zechiras Shabbos. Says the Rebbe, now let's have a look at the order of how the Alter Rebbe brings these two opinions. The Alter Rebbe actually brings first the opinion that it's about adding in covered Yom Tov, and then brings the opinion about adding in covered Shabbos. And why is that? Because in Avodah, l'chatchila, we do deal with the bad, and we need to remove ourselves from the bad, sur meira. And therefore that's going to be the opinion that Erev is about Yom Tov. Then we'll come to the next opinion, that it's about adding in covered Shabbos, in other words, more about the positive, more about dealing with Kedusha itself in a world where there is no negativity, like Shabbos. Now, we mentioned earlier also that the difference between these two opinions is that according to the reason that it's l'kavod Yom Tov, that you shouldn't bake and cook from Yom Tov to Shabbos, then technically you would be allowed to make the Erev earlier, whereas if the reason is l'kavod Shabbos, you must make it on the day of Erev Yom Tov. So now let's look at the Alter Rebbe's psak regarding that. The Alter Rebbe said, l'chatchila, it's better to do it in Erev Yom Tov, but b'diavad, even if you did it earlier, it's fine. In other words, l'chatchila, we are taking into consideration also the opinion that it's l'kavod Shabbos, that's why you have to do it right before Yom Tov, but b'diavad, it would be fine, even if you did it earlier. So now we can understand that as well. In other words, of course, l'chatchila, it's better to be involved in the avodah of Shabbos as well. This kedusha dika removed from klipa completely, purely asay toiv, or what Chassidus calls the avodah of ishapcha, completely, absolutely no bad. Or at least sometimes you have to be involved in it. But at the least, at the minimum level, we definitely have to have the avodah, at least that Yom Tov dika avodah, which is the sur meira, the level of iskafi or the level of a beinani. Now the Rebbe concludes, and the Rebbe says there's one more point. We hold on to this, on the one hand, we hold on to the Erev, as we said before, all the way to the third meal, which represents the highest level of Shabbos. So the Shlish is the highest level of Shabbos. But when do we make the Erev? We make it before Yom Tov. Yom Tov is a level that we're already dealing with, as we said, at least bringing the Kedusha into Yom Tov, Yom Tov the Kedusha into weekdays. But when you make the Erev, that's before Yom Tov. That means you didn't even start with the Yom Tov Dekavayda, but what are you planning for? All the way for Su'udah Shlishis. In other words, we're right away planning for the highest level already. In other words, that itself, when we're working towards and that highest goal, that itself helps us that we should do our Avodah in the very best way right from the outset.